Welcome to Audio Mastering Short Explainers, and once again to our new segment, From the Horse's Mouths. We dive into real-world discussions happening right now in professional mastering circles and audio communities online. We'll be sifting through the heated debates and sometimes controversial opinions direct from working audio mastering engineers. Our goal here is simple: to go straight to the source and help us all separate the tried and true knowledge from the ever-present audio dogma. So get ready for another unfiltered perspective, because in From the Horse's Mouths, you're hearing it straight from the pros. All right, let's get into our second topic of the week. A question that keeps also popping up in audio professional groups is, have plugins already reached the pinnacle of analog mastering gear emulation? This is exactly the kind of debate we're going to tackle today, so let's get into this new segment right now.
All right, so to really unpack this, we're going to break it down into 6 key areas. First up, we'll look at the Great Divide, the real purist arguments. Then we'll get into why it's not just sound. After that, we'll touch on the psychology of it all in minds, money, and marketing, and follow that with a really interesting digital versus digital case study. Then we'll shift focus to the Craftsman and the tools before we finally land on the one thing everyone seems to agree on, the only thing that matters.
So let's kick things off by jumping right into the deep end. We're going to look at the 2 most extreme positions you'll find out there. You know how it is in any passionate debate? You've got people on opposite ends of the field, and this one is definitely no exception. So we're starting with those black and white, no gray area arguments, coming straight from working professionals in our mastering group. Okay, so on one side of the ring, you've got an engineer who has some seriously high-end analog gear. We're talking top-shelf stuff. And for them, it's not even a competition. They say they've tried a few times to compare their prized hardware directly against its plugin emulation, and it's just, well, not even close. In their view, the plugin sounds like a joke, and the only real thing they have in common is the picture on the computer screen. Their verdict? Miles away. But then, hold on, because here comes the complete opposite take. You have another professional who also owns some very expensive hardware, including a classic Soundtech EQ, telling a totally different story. This engineer has actually put it to the test. They've run blind A/B tests, sending files to other hardware purists, and the results are pretty stunning. Not only could these seasoned engineers not reliably pick out which was the real hardware, a lot of the time they actually said they preferred the sound of the plugin. Now that really shows you just how deep this divide runs. So let's just lay it all out there. You've basically got 2 main camps. In one corner, you have the analog is king crowd. They believe that even the absolute best software emulations are just pale imitations. They feel plugins lack that unique sonic touch, that magic, that special sauce you only get from real, high-quality analog circuits. But in the other corner, you've got the plugins are there camp. They argue that the technology has come so far that any differences are now just tiny, often totally imperceptible in a proper blind test. And for them, the convenience and perfect recall of plugins make them the smarter, more practical choice in a modern workflow. These 2 viewpoints really set the stage for this entire conversation. Okay, so we've set up the 2 poles of the argument, right? The die-hard analog fans and the confident plugin proponents. But as you've probably guessed, the reality for most working pros isn't so black and white. Most of them live somewhere in the middle. And that brings us to our second section, where we explore the idea that this choice, it's about so much more than just the sound. It's about workflow, it's about tactile feel, and it's about the rise of the hybrid studio. A whole lot of engineers are saying, hey, why does this have to be an either-or fight? They see it as a team-up, not a competition. And this is what they call the hybrid approach. The consensus in the group is that many, if not most, of the top-tier mastering engineers, we're talking about the folks at legendary places like Abbey Road, Metropolis, Sterling Sound, they all work this way. They're using digital tools and plugins for what they're best at: surgical precision, perfect recall, and just sheer convenience. But when they need that vibe, that character, that hard-to-define sonic enhancement, they reach for their racks of analog hardware. The big takeaway here is that a great engineer just uses the right tool for the specific job. And sometimes, if a track comes in sounding amazing and just needs a clean level adjustment, staying completely in the box with plugins might actually give you a better, more transparent result. Let's break that down a bit more. When engineers say plugins are there, they often mean specifically for clean processing. So for any task where you don't want to add color or change the character, like a very precise EQ cut, a high-quality digital tool is basically identical to a transparent piece of hardware. Plus, plugins can do things that are just flat out impossible in the analog world, like really complex dynamic automation that changes throughout a song. On the flip side, hardware is still the champion for its vibe. This is where you get into all those cool nonlinearities, the subtle distortions and artifacts from real transformers and tubes.
Engineers talk about this stuff adding depth, space, and a sense of aliveness to the music that they feel is still the special domain of physical circuits. It's that special sauce that keeps all those racks of gear humming in studios all over the world.
Now, in the middle of all this talk about sound and sonics, a really powerful analogy came up in the discussion, and it perfectly captures a whole other dimension of this debate. It has less to do with what your ears are hearing and a lot more to do with how you actually work. This quote came from a professional who also happens to be a pilot, which is pretty cool. And he makes this brilliant point. He says that a flight simulator is an incredible tool, right? You can learn navigation, practice procedures, and save a ton of money on flight time. But it can never, ever replicate the actual feeling of being in a real cockpit with your hands on the actual controls. Another engineer chimed in and compared it to race car simulators versus driving a real Ferrari. The point isn't just about how it looks or sounds. It's about the physical connection, that tactile experience. And for a lot of engineers, that is a huge, huge factor. So you see, the choice of tools really goes way beyond just how they sound. There's that tactile feel, the simple physical joy of grabbing and turning a real knob. There's the creative flow that can happen when you're interacting with a physical object instead of clicking a mouse. And honestly, there's the fun factor. Enjoyment and motivation are a real part of the creative process. For some, it's also just about ergonomics, getting away from the computer screen for a bit. But on the other hand, everyone agrees that plugins are an absolutely incredible learning tool. They let you test drive iconic, super expensive gear that you might never get your hands on otherwise, which is amazing for developing your ears. But of course, these decisions aren't made in a perfect, sterile bubble. Beyond the sound and the workflow, there's another layer to this whole debate, a slightly more cynical one, you might say. So now let's dive into the psychological, the financial, and the marketing forces that could be shaping some of these very strong opinions. So, I want to put a question to you that came up over and over again in the group discussion. When you hear an engineer passionately defending their super expensive hardware, are you hearing a purely objective judgment about the sound? Or are you maybe hearing a little bit of confirmation bias, something influenced by pretty significant financial investment? And this quote really gets to the heart of it. Several engineers made this exact point. Look, if you've spent tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars on analog equipment, there is a very powerful psychological reason for you to believe that it's superior. You're invested, and not just with your money, but emotionally too. You want to justify that massive expense. Now, this doesn't mean the hardware isn't fantastic, it usually is, but it does suggest that our perception isn't always 100% objective. The investment itself can actually become part of the perceived difference in quality. And this whole idea extends to the business side of things too. Does plastering your website with pictures of expensive gear actually get you more clients? Well, as you can probably guess, opinions were completely split. One camp says, yes, absolutely. They argue that a lot of potential clients are actively looking for engineers with analog gear, and it's just smart marketing. One pro put it beautifully. A sushi master telling you he has the best tuna isn't bragging. He's telling the customer about the quality of his ingredients. But then the other camp says, no, not at all. They see their clients couldn't care less about gear lists. They only care about how the final master sounds. They argue that talking about gear just creates a meaningless bias, and that the real focus should always be on the client's art, not the engineer's toolbox. This next part is, for me, one of the most fascinating bits of the entire discussion. We're going to take a step away from the classic analog versus digital fight for a minute and look at a very specific, very interesting case study. We're talking about comparing a legendary piece of digital hardware, the Weiss DS1 compressor, to its own official plugin, which is marketed as being a line-for-line identical port of the original code. This should be easy, right? Same code, same sound. Well, let's see about that. So one of the engineers posted some audio files comparing the hardware unit and the software plugin, both with the exact same settings. And the reactions from other top pros were just all over the map. It was amazing. One person said the hardware version had more depth, it was more open and natural. Another claimed the plugin's highs sounded brittle and that the stereo image was collapsing in the low mids. But then another engineer listened to the same files and said, you know what? I think the software version actually sounds better. And this is the key point. Even when you're comparing two digital devices that are supposed to be running the exact same code, our perception is still incredibly subjective. So if the code is supposedly the same, why on earth would there be an audible difference? Well, the engineers proposed some really smart theories. The gist of it is that the hardware and the software are running in completely different environments. The original hardware box uses a specific type of processing chip from its era, a Shark DSP chip with 40-bit floating point math.
The plugin is using the immense power of a modern 64-bit computer. It's kind of like two chefs following the same recipe, but one is using a vintage oven and the other is using a top-of-the-line modern one. Even the way the digital signal goes in and out is handled differently. Some even suggested that tiny little imperfections in the older hardware, what one engineer called digital grunge, are actually part of its sought-after character. The bottom line is, even if the code is identical, the context where that code runs can absolutely change the final result.
Okay, so after all this talk about circuits and code and digital grunge, the conversation naturally circled back to the single most important component in any studio, the human being sitting in that chair. This section is all about how skill, experience, and personal taste are what really shape the final sound, way more than any single piece of gear ever could. This quote just perfectly captures this unifying feeling that started to emerge from the whole debate. It's not a simple case of the ears versus the gear. It's just not. An inexperienced engineer with the best gear in the world is probably not going to get a great result. And a world-class engineer can definitely be held back by subpar tools. The real magic happens at that intersection, where skill meets quality equipment. It's the craftsmen and their tools that create the masterpiece. The discussion really drove home how critical an engineer's experience and, this is a big one, their monitoring environment are. One professional made this fascinating point. He said that as his monitoring got better and better over the years, he found he actually had less need for his coloring boxes. And why is that? Because with a truly accurate, high-end listening system, he could hear exactly what was needed with incredible precision and apply it surgically with digital tools. He no longer needed to rely on the built-in character of an analog piece to get him where he needed to go. Ultimately, great engineers develop a personal taste and a signature style, and that's what clients are really hiring them for. A good engineer will make great-sounding masters with the tools they have, because they know how to use them to achieve their vision.
And just when you think the whole debate is kind of settling down, one engineer comes in and completely flips the entire script with this really provocative question. For decades, the entire conversation has been about software trying to perfectly emulate hardware, right? Is the plugin as good as the box yet? But this question, it forces us to think about all the unique, powerful things that digital can do that analog has never even tried to replicate. Things like dynamic EQ, look-ahead limiting, complex spectral processing, the list goes on. It's just a brilliant way to reframe the entire discussion. It acknowledges that digital isn't just an emulator anymore. It's its own powerful and unique platform for creativity.
Okay, we have navigated all the technical arguments, the psychological biases, the workflow preferences, and even the philosophical questions. This brings us to our final section, where we're going to synthesize all of these conflicting, passionate viewpoints into the one single conclusion that almost every single professional in this long discussion came to agree on.
And this is it. This is the ultimate truth that just kept coming up again and again. After all the passionate arguments about tubes and transformers versus code and algorithms, this is the bottom line. Does the master sound great? Are the clients happy with the result? That is the only metric that truly matters. Whether an engineer used a 10-foot rack of glowing analog gear, a laptop full of plugins, or a hybrid of both, that's just a detail on the journey to getting a great-sounding record and a satisfied artist. Okay then, that brings us to the end of another segment relevant to mastering. This whole series is really about getting you answers straight from audio professionals. And while, for legal reasons, we have tried to keep their names private, every bit of information was reported to you almost verbatim. So, what's on your mind? What's a debate you want to hear more about? Leave it in the comments telling us what you'd like to know. Please subscribe, share, and like the Audio Mastering channel so that this information can reach an even wider online audience. You may also like the video playlist on the top right side of your screen. See you next time.